When it comes to providing comprehensible input, is it possible to use authentic resources? Well, in this episode, we explore how to use authentic listening resources as a form of comprehensible input with Steven Lopez, who is a Spanish teacher in New York. Steven shares his process for preparing and scaffolding listening tasks so that students are able to confidently understand the target language in authentic contexts. You'll walk away with lots of ideas to use in your classroom. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you for being here. Yes, you know, I say thank you for listening, which thank you very much. I appreciate that. But thank you for being a teacher who's listening to a podcast about language teaching, because that's just showing what a great, wonderful teacher you are and how invested you are. So thank you very much for doing that. So on the podcast, you often hear us talking about CI, comprehensible input, Stephen Krashen, comprehensible input hypothesis, all of those things. And often when we talk about CI, when we talk about listening, we're talking about sort of in the moment, and often feels very novice level when we talk about CI listening and how do you make the input comprehensible. But then we focus a lot more, I tend to see in our language teaching field, on reading as comprehensible input. And a lot of that goes back to the work of Steven Krashen, because he talks a lot about reading being fundamental in literacy and language acquisition. But I wanted to explore this idea of using listening comprehension more as CI of comprehensible input than having the literacy aspect. And so to help us with this conversation today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Steven Lopez, who is a Spanish teacher in New York, and he's been teaching for about 15 years. He spent his time 6 years in the trenches of middle school, my people, but he's been at the high school level for about 9 years. And he has been quite involved in his regional and state language associations, NICEFL, LILT. You know, I love a state language association, so I appreciate the fact that he's doing that. But I also follow him on social media, so I see a lot of his reels where he's talking about what he's doing with his students, and I just know that he has a lot to share, and he's definitely someone whose mind I just want to dive into to learn more about this. So welcome to the podcast, Steven. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
How did you start down your journey of comprehensible input and just your methodology, the way you go about your teaching? What's your journey been like with that?
Over the years, just following other teachers as well, seeing what is out there. I will say, though, when I did transition from middle school to high school, my mentor, her name is Anita, and she's actually retiring this year. She was very formative in me learning how to adjust my instructional strategies for the upper levels, because I had done, 6th, 7th, 8th grade for 6 years. And then I went straight to doing seniors, a university level course, and also some intermediate levels as well. And so observing her and seeing what she did, that was very formative for me. And then just over time, especially during the pandemic, we had a lot of time. So seeing other teachers and things that they do all inspired me. One thing I love about teaching is, even though you have a lot of experience and in a way you feel like a veteran teacher, if you have an open mind, you can always learn something new. And you can always, or you take something that you did and see someone else do it differently and apply it and make it your own. So I would definitely say with social media and all the different platforms, so YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, seeing what other teachers do, and like, that really is a good idea. I can make it this way for my own. I do it regularly. That's my own level of like constant professional development.
Yes, I know that you definitely bring a perspective of being in the trenches with your students, because I think I first discovered you with your Friday reels. What were they called that you were doing during the pandemic?
I don't even remember, but it was just Friday after the kids went out for, they went for the day and it was hybrid. So I was like, here's what I'm doing in
Mm-hmm.
the hybrid format that is working for me. And I would kind of just reflect on it. And that was actually the first time when I made, I have my own personal account, but that's when I made a public one because I was getting so much from other people. I wanted to, if anyone was interested in seeing or listening,
Mm-hmm.
offer my own things that were working for me at the time, which
Mm-hmm.
we're all looking for a way to keep our kids engaged during those dire circumstances.
Yeah, later on we'll talk about how we can have teachers connect with you, but I will just say right now, in case I don't remember to say it then, that once we have your Instagram, that if teachers go to your Instagram account and they go back through your feed and find some of your reels from back when you were doing that, because I thought they were incredibly informative, particularly for teachers that were in that situation at that time. And it just felt very like in the trenches, this is what's working. So thank you very much for
Yeah.
doing that, and it helped
Thank-
me to discover you. So let's start down this conversation of interpretive listening and strategies for interpretive listening and activities in our classrooms. And
Mhm.
so could you start by just giving us your framework understanding of how interpretive listening serves as such a foundational skill for students in the language acquisition process?
So as you mentioned, when we talk about CI, we always go back to Stephen Krashen, and for our students, we focus a lot on reading. But if we really think about the natural way of learning, we learned by just sitting quietly and observing our surroundings for years, and that was pretty much verbal communication, right? Interpretive listening, spoken communication. So that is a skill that we learn naturally. And so I think also with so much that we have at our fingertips and people are posting constantly and there's almost too much of like there's an abundance of resources. There's really great stuff available that you can really cater to your students. And so I really have spent a lot of time trying to use audio sources, some that are authentic and some that are designed for students. And I don't always think that authentic resources like are 100% the way to use. Of course we need them, but I also think that I'm going to, in this discussion, just talk a lot about this podcast series I use, Charlas Hispanas. And they are, yes, they're designed for intermediate advanced students, but the topics are very captivating. They're very varied. They can apply to the interests of all our students, and they are somewhat challenging. So it does stay very in line with that whole idea of input plus one. So it's at their level, but a little bit challenging. And with this, they grow. And I have seen their listening skills grow greatly.
This idea of authentic resources, and you kind of touched upon it there, like the sometimes, and there's all these different camps that happen in our language teaching world. There are the grammar teachers and the ones who don't teach grammar. There are the ones who do 100% target language. There are the ones that don't do 100%. And there's such a divide. And one of those is the authentic resources. And I'm only using authentic resources. And first off, I think that we just need fewer divides. If kids are using the language and acquiring the language, have
Mhm.
at it, do a workshop at a conference and show us how you're doing it.
Mhm.
But I recently was speaking with a colleague at a conference, and she referenced this idea of authentic resources and saying that they were digestible authentic resources. And that sat really well with me because I often see authentic resources that are beyond the proficiency level of students, and
Yeah,
that's just not something they can do. So what we're looking for is digestible
absolutely.
authentic
Yeah.
resources. So that was just something I heard recently that I wanted to share. Let's continue on talking about this interpretive listening, and how does incorporating authentic listening materials enhance students' confidence and expressing themselves, and even bring that into their writing and their speaking? So how is that working all together?
One thing that I like to do was, I just should note that I teach level 4 and 5. That would be if it were pre AP for level 4 and AP for level 5. And we have a dual enrollment with the university. So I do this activity once for level 4 and once for level 5. Of course, we as language teachers, we know that student engagement and student buy-in is really important for them to be, working with anything and giving attention to anything. And so the series that I've used over the last couple of years and really have harnessed and turned into like this, like a principal resource, is Charlas Hispanas, and it's a website that it's free. You can, of course, use a premium version and get the transcripts and the exercises, but it's free and they're posting constantly. So, and about anything and everything. And so when I have my students choose one that they're going to kind of lead, they have so many topics from which to choose. So right there, they have one that I hope that they really are interested in, that they really kind of make their own. Then I do this activity with them where they listen to it in class. We have headphones, and then I've kind of modeled this before with my own activities with them. So I wouldn't just kind of say, you're going to do this. Like, they've seen the practice that I do with them and the type of things that I've presented to them. So they choose a podcast. They are about 10 minutes in length. So they're pretty, they're, as you said, like, digestible. They're not short, that the content is really quick, but not long enough where it's out of their realm and out of their reach. And the topics are varied. And so they choose a topic they really like, they listen to it, they take their own notes. And then the first step that I have them do then is to make a list of questions because they're going to lead a small group discussion at a later date. And I guide them through the questions to ask that are not just comprehension questions, but they kind of follow Bloom's taxonomy. So they have a couple that are comprehension based, just to make sure that their group mates are following along. And then there are compare, contrast, opinion based questions, application, kind of like hypothetical scenarios. And that works well for me because of that level that I teach, and they have the language to be able to communicate. When everything is said and done, they have led a small group discussion for 20 to 30 minutes. Sometimes they don't even know that they're doing that. And I remind them, like, just so you're aware, I stood back and you all sat in a group, you had your headphones, you had your splitters, you listen to a podcast fully in the target language for 10 minutes, and you engage in a 20, 25-minute discussion on a variety of topics. And it's non-evaluative, and I'm not on top of them. I step back. And so every student has the opportunity to lead that discussion. So they are a leader. They guide their peers. They are making sure they're staying in the target language. So it's a way for them to really delve deep into a topic they like. They can have a open-ended discussion, which I think students like to do when especially it's non-evaluative. They can communicate with each other fully in the target language. So it's student ownership and student choice.
That choice piece, that's where the agency definitely comes in, with students giving them the choice there. So I would like to just dive in a little bit to the process. What are you doing to get them to be listening with the expectation that they might not understand every word? Like, what is that whole process you're doing to set students up to be able to listen for 10 minutes and get something out of it?
So absolutely, we want to make sure we give the students the scaffolding necessary to engage in whatever discussion we're going to have. So again, using the podcast in mind, and I'll give you, a variety of topics. It can be on an artist. It can be on a specific celebration in a Spanish-speaking country. It can be on a historical figure. It can be on a holiday. It could be on a meal, anything really. If I've led a discussion, or if I'm teaching something and I'm going to use a podcast, for example, or even a video, I will make a slides presentation. And first it's images that represent to that, so I can guide them. That see, think, wonder. What do we see? What are we observing here? What are our thoughts about this? What are our opinions? What do you ask yourself? What comes to mind? What curiosities? What lingering questions do you have? So activating prior knowledge and see what vocabulary they have. Next, I prepare a series of slides that have keywords. When I've led them through a discussion, I have keywords that are necessary for them to understand the main ideas, but also when I do have later questions, that they know those ahead of time. Another thing I like to do with them is something called SADE. Instead of just giving the English definition or the translation, in my level 5 class, Feria de las Flores in Colombia, that beautiful floral festival in the summertime. So I'll do a word like silletero or silleta or Antioquia or desfile, parade. And I'll write words that are similar, so synonyms. I'll write an antonym or word that means something completely opposite. I'll use circumlocution to describe what it is, defining my own words in the target language. And then E is an example. So I'm using the target language and giving them multiple ways to personalize that word and not just having the English translation. And always images too. So every keyword has images. I survey my students at the beginning of the year, and one of the questions I ask them is, what learning style do you possess? And click multiple that apply. And the number one every year for the majority of them is visual learners. Mm-hmm. So as much as I can, I try to include rich images. So that's that. They have that. So then they have the pre-discussion questions, the see, think, wonder. We have the keywords. We have the word association descriptions, lots of images. and now they have somewhat of a foundation, so then they can listen to it. And of course, when we tell our students, if you listen, you understand every word, great, you're going to understand the majority, and there's going to be some things that you don't. But the idea is that you're taking notes. The idea is that we get the overall main idea, right? After they listen to it, then I have my own slides presentation that is a summary. So I'll make anywhere from 5 to 8 or 6 to 10, depending on what the topic is. And I'll have an image or two images, and I'll have a sentence or two describing how this relates to the podcast, how this is, or the audio source, what if it's a video, how this is a main or central idea of what was said. And so we have the pre-discussion questions, the keywords, with all that input. We have the podcast I listened to, and then I made a slides presentation with images and summary. So if they didn't catch something, if they missed something, if there was some misconceptions, I then have clarified it. So now, with all that said and done, now I have my list of discussion questions, as I mentioned before, using Bloom's taxonomy as a model. So some lower thinking, some recall, up to kind of higher order thinking. And they're in small groups, and I'll do one or two at a time. Have a few minutes to chat in their groups. And then after a few minutes are done, then I engage with a couple students at random. I have their names on cards, and we get that discussion. And that's something that I do regularly. When I taught level 1, 2, and 3, I did the same thing. Of course, now what language I use, the sources are different, of course. The sources are more suited to their level. They have a chat mat. They have, a list of helpful phrases that we've been using in class that I've scaffolded. And what I'm expecting output wise, of course, is different in my level 2 class when I taught that to my seniors, of course. So everything I'm saying right now can be modified to middle school, to, college level. It's what is the resource you're using? Is that aligned to their proficiency level? And what are you expecting to them to produce? Are you setting them up for failure or success?
Can you go back to when you mentioned the SAVE acronym? Because we kind of went really quickly through that.
Yeah.
And can you tell us again what each letter stands for?
Well, yeah. So SAVE. S is synonyms, words that, so maybe they're not exactly synonyms of words of the same family, or words that have a similar meaning. A, antonyms. So, and again, antonyms are difficult. Maybe they don't always have one, but a word that kind of goes in the other direction. D is description or definition. So, it is an event where people march down the streets, and they could be chanting, or they can have, signs, things like that. And then E is using it as an example, using the word in context. So synonyms, antonyms, description or definition, and example.
So as I was listening to you, I totally heard you say SAVE, and I was thinking there was a V in there. So I'm so happy that I asked, because I was like, I totally missed it. I don't know what the V was, but it was a D. So I'm happy I asked. I really appreciate how you are bringing the concept of Bloom's taxonomy into it, because I also think that is lending itself to differentiation as well, where you're going to have students that are at their different proficiency levels are going to interact differently. So if you have a lower proficiency level student, then they're going to be lower on Bloom's in terms of the single words or the multiple words or the smaller concepts, rather than making a synthesis in all of that. And I think that when we are talking about proficiency levels, a lot of times we're so focused on output, like that's their proficiency level. Like, what is their text type that they're producing? Are they speaking in paragraphs or connected sentences or single words? But in terms of the interpretive listening, those proficiency levels align well with Bloom's. Let's talk a little more of the practical. What is happening like in the moments when the students aren't totally understanding?
One activity that I do with podcasts, when that's more of like when I have the students leading their own discussion, but when they're not doing that, I use them regularly. Again, they could be a video, and I am just playing the audio, and then we'll watch the video later on, or we're actually doing another podcast, like the same series. One thing that I think is really helpful for students to do, especially when everything is digital now, is good old-fashioned note-taking. That is such a skill that is, I think, underestimated. And I try to bring it back as much as I can. And I tell the kids they know again now, when we're doing a listening activity, they know exactly what they need to do. I'm like, there's no right or wrong way to take notes. I want you to take notes that make sense for you, because we're going to stop and do comprehension checks. And so we'll choose another topic now. Let's say Day of the Dead. We love teaching about Day of the Dead. Spanish teachers, it's a beautiful celebration. And so when I'm introducing that to my students, I'll play the the source, the audio source. And I have my own slides presentation now with images, just as we're going along, and as they're listening to it, they're seeing the slides on the board, but they're also taking notes. And I'll stop every 2-3 minutes. They are sharing what they have understood with the C partner or small group. I've taught them to categorize based off of nouns, verbs, and adjectives. So as you're listening to it, what nouns do we hear? What verbs do we hear? What adjectives do we hear? I do my, I'm checking with my students. We make a list, and then we'll have a discussion. Oh, interesting. You mentioned this word, el altar. Can you tell me what they mentioned about the podcast? And they'll tell me. And if it's not quite accurate, that is your opportunity as a teacher to correct that misunderstanding, that preconceived, that misconception. Mm-hmm. And that helps everybody out. You're taking an idea and repeating it over and over and over again. And that's, basic tenet of CI. So I would never, ever play an audio file for 10 minutes and not do any kind of pause refocus or, redirection or just kind of comprehension checks. If it's another topic, like something just about overview of a country, I can say list words that are aligned to that, categorized by geography, about food, about people, about clothing. And so they're thinking a little differently as well. They're listening and they're trying to classify words based off, their classification. And that's another level of thinking as well. And so there's a lot of ways you can do that comprehension check. Again, another way that I think is low stress is letting them just share their thinking with the group. And maybe they didn't get a lot of words, but their partner or the partner shared, and they have something else to say out loud if I did call on them or they did want to participate. And if it's a lower level, was it this or that? Did he mention this or did he mention this instead? So you give them that A or B option. And then they say it and you repeat it again. Oh, yes, he was talking about this and this is how it relates to that. And they do this in this country.
So I was hearing as you were going through there, the words content word and function word were like popping into my mind. Yeah. So like those content words, which anchor the text, and particularly with lower proficiency level students, like the idea is to get them to find those content words, not the prepositions and the articles and the function words that tie it all together, but looking at those function words. So I was listening as you were going through and it's like, oh, okay. So it's that process of pulling out those words and then making sense by using the function words around it. Yeah. So I want to sort of land this a bit and talk about assessment. And because you had mentioned there's a lot of formative assessment going through, and you even said that some of the agency part of it with students choosing is it's actually not being assessed. Yeah. But there does come a part in our classrooms where we have to assess. Yeah. And doing all the scaffolding and doing the images and the see, think, wonder and doing your SADE and preparing them for that. But then when it comes to listening as an assessment, do you provide that same scaffolding? Do you use the same listening text? How does that look like what does it look like when it comes to assessment?
So I do it a variety of ways. Sometimes I'll do them in class, and sometimes, believe it or not, I'll assign it for homework. I'll post a link, the audio source. I'll post a slides presentation with just images. And I'll post a Google Forms quiz. And what I'll do is I'll timestamp it. So for example, as I'm listening to the podcast, I'm taking my own notes and I'll say, okay, from 1:30 to 3:30, the speaker was discussing this topic. And so then I'll say, again, the questions vary, and there could be some comprehension-based questions, to make sure that they got that. But then like, from this fragment here, would you say the speaker would agree with this statement, true or false? What would be an appropriate subtitle for these 2 minutes? So they have to kind of think backwards a little bit, like take it and then put a title to it. Based off of this section, who would be a target audience? And I'll list a couple options. So there's a lot of ways you can ask questions. And again, that goes what I was saying before to lower levels, just some basic recall, true, false. And then some that they really have to listen closely and listen carefully to get like a different notion. Another thing too is with the sealed by literacy, which we do, that interpretive sheet they have to do, they ask for the speaker or author's perspective, and they give some options, or the organizational features. So you can allow them to, on a Google Forms quiz, instead of multiple choice, to input their responses. So there's a lot of types of questions you can ask, and not just multiple choice, true, false. but a variety of thinking that can happen there. If I do it in class, I know I'm gonna have to give a lot of class time for that. Or sometimes I'll play it in class, we'll discuss it a little bit, and I'll say, okay, your quiz is for homework. So if they need to listen to it a second time, that's fine.
So I would be interested to know, Stephen, where you continue to pull your inspiration from and what you can be recommending to listeners.
There's a teacher that really inspires me. If you're a Spanish teacher, you definitely know him, Diego Ojeda. Whenever he posts constantly, and I love that for him. And we've spoken a lot. I met him this past fall at ACTFL. He has a breadth of experience, and what he says is always so spot on and always so practical. And like you mentioned before, people really like to take an idea that is just, it can just be quickly applied to their own context. So he is someone that I very much admire, very much respect. Another one, she just won Teacher of the Year from Skolt, Berta Delgadillo. She is wonderful. She pours her heart and soul into teaching. I met her as well in ACTFL. She was very helpful when I did my national board a few years ago. She had just certified year before me.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Diego. I've known him for a number of years. And Berta was on the podcast last year, and we spoke about online translators. I absolutely second those wonderful human beings and teachers and educators that do so much for the teaching community. So how can we be connecting with you, Steven?
My handle is Profe Lopez 21, so PROFE LOPEZ 21. You can add me on there. It's a public account, and I do post, and I do have things that I share with my student work and other things here and there. So definitely, if you want to connect on there, I'm happy to connect with you.
And that's on Instagram, correct?
Yeah, Profe
Instagram. I'll make sure that's in the show notes so everybody can click right there. So as we finish up here, I always like to leave teachers with a good, hearty piece of advice. So what could you leave with us? It could be about your teaching experience in general, or something specific about listening and listening comprehension.
One thing I started doing with National Board, one of the foundational principles is getting to know your students, but truly knowing them. And we know them in a variety of ways. But one thing I did was I made this really long questionnaire on Google Forms, and it had questions from tell me about your study habits. What are some things that you've enjoyed in your language classes? What's your favorite class? Least favorite class? Your learning style, etc. But one thing that I always ask them is I say, here are a list of themes and topics that we could possibly study this year. And I list the 20 whatever global themes that the World Language associations offer. And after my, I have this year 3 sections of level 4 and 2 of level 5. So after everyone has done them, they compile the results and I show the little kind of bar graph. And so that's really helpful for me because as I mentioned before with student agency, I let them know, I said, okay, so next week we're going to study this because the majority of you said you want to do a unit on this.
It's interesting because when people think of Stephen Krashen, we all know his comprehensible input. He's the person behind all that, the I+1. But he also has his a little bit lesser known theory of compelling input hypothesis.
Yes.
And what you're talking about right there is exactly that you can give all the comprehensible input you want to students, but if they don't care to listen to it and they're not interested in it, they're not going to pay as much attention than if they are. So what you're saying right there is bringing that comprehensible input right into the world of compelling. So thank you for bringing that to the light right here at the end. So thank you so much for everything you shared with us, Stephen. And I'm going to be looking in specifically to doing some sade, not save, with my students now that I get it and try that out when we do some listening. But thank you for everything you shared with us and for spending your time with us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Steven Lopez? I will certainly be trying out Sade and not Save. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Steven. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. And there are also links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together, either in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.